I'm going to talk to some slides, and I think I'm going to probably spend about half an hour, 40 minutes talking through these slides. And what I'd really like to do is to find a way of talking about some of the work that my practice does, but not just talking about the work, because that can be a bit hermetic. So to try to place it in the context of this exhibition, this activity, which I think is a real privilege actually to be invited into this setting, because as you'll see in the presentation, the openness and the generosity of what's going on here, I think is one of the things that makes me want to be an architect in the projects that I work on, and I often try and find a way of making projects not just about the project. So yeah, I'm an architect. I've tended to work in cities. I actually started the practice when there was a recession, we didn't have any work, and I'd been made redundant about 7 times, and I was fed up of losing my job, so I thought I'd make myself redundant. And actually that really was good because it made me think about what I was doing. It really flipped my brain around. And then I got together with another guy and we set up a practice, and then that went well, and I'll show you some slides about that. Yeah, I should probably talk to the slides really. I mean, I've sort of thought about the slides. But first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me, because this is great, isn't it? This is good.
Thanks for coming.
No Public Realm, okay, that's the title, and that title came out of a discussion with Paul and me, and this discussion, I think there's a couple of people who wanted to, they're hovering at the door, maybe they think it's not open. We had a discussion about invisibility. Everything that Paul does is somehow always about invisibility, and I'll show you a bit more about that. So the kind of the notion that there is no public realm is something to unpack during this presentation. Maybe it's something we can talk about at the end of this, because after I've talked, it would be very nice to just have, but this size of group, it would be just great to have a conversation. It should be quite relaxed. Next, please. So I have a practice with 2 directors, co-directors, and we're called East. And we've been going kind of 22 years approximately, and we've always been interested in the city, and these are the kinds of things that we've been doing over the years. I think the word I heard recently was generalist, which is not a very good word, but it's a kind of word that reminds you that people do all sorts of things in their daily lives. No matter what they're doing, they do more than just the thing they're doing, unless you're Richard Long or someone who does only one thing their whole life. We tend to do schools, housing, urban projects, been doing a lot of teaching, but all of those projects are from the perspective of the city. And when we started, one of the things that helped us set the perspective was not having any work and going walking in order to find out what was needed and to find clients by exploring, in this case, East London. That's why I'm called East. Kind of went east down the river past the cement factories and the marshes and the kind of dumping grounds for waste, which turned into beautiful landscapes to have picnics on. So that experience of going walking and finding something without knowing what it was you were looking for was a very formative moment architecturally for me, because it meant that I wasn't being told what to think. I was trying to work out what I was looking at, what I was looking for. We could have a discussion about that, and then we could go and speak to the people in the council and say, we think this. And then we, little bit by bit, began to get work. So all of it, even a housing project, is really from the perspective of the city, how it sits, who's it for, And actually that's where form comes from, it's where materiality comes from, I think. Ideas come from place. And one of the things I realise is that you never really quite know what you're doing. You always have to kind of work out what it is that the project is about. Even if you have a brief, you still got to kind of work it out, like, yeah, but what if we didn't do it? You know, what's it good for? And that's a great process. That's a process I enjoy very much. I enjoy the practice. So the next slide is a kind of map of some of the projects we've been doing. We're a London-centric practice. We tend to work within the M25, but we also, of course, do excursions in Switzerland and actually Brazil, and of course Holland quite a lot over the years, because it's a place I like very much to come to and to work in. But this drawing is not just sites that we've done projects in. It's like every black line is a project. So these are Transport for London road networks, where we helped the Transport for London TfL, who managed the road networks, to talk about the palette of materials, the colour of the lamp columns. It used to be very complicated. They would have all sorts of different materials. It was kind of a mess, and we said you should simplify it. And so in the centre of London, maybe you paint things black, where you have lots of shadows because you have lots of buildings and relief and contrast. And as you go further out, maybe you paint things grey because the sky is more visible and you don't want so much contrast. And so there's a kind of an idea of all sorts of different projects, and this plan shows you places where buildings have been built, or urban plans have been suggested, or a kind of series of streets have been in some way addressed. And of course, what's important to understand about this is that this kind of picture demands us to remember that we are not the only people making things happen. We're always working alongside all sorts of other people getting things done. And so that collaborative element of architecture, I think, is something that architects are generally very bad at. They don't like... I met one the other day, and God, I mean, they just didn't want to talk because they were so worried that their ideas would be stolen from them. It was just incredible. So sharing ideas is just like, it's normal, isn't it? It's like what people want to do, you would have thought. But architects often can't quite cope with it. So the next slide is a very early drawing that we made when we won this first project in Borough High Street. And the project was before, it was a kind of 1999, so it was before the Tate Modern was built. And this is Borough High Street, so this is a very old street, Dickensian Street, and the Thames is up there off of the slide. And we didn't know what to do. The project was improve the street. That was the directive. And the idea was that as these new developments come forward, you try to find, you almost problematise the place, you ask other people what they think is wrong. And then you realise that actually, yeah, you're not the only people involved. This here was already planned because it was a bridge and a new underground station, and this here was another plan. So it's a kind of Frankenstein bolt-together plan of other people's plans, and we called it Catch and Steer, because what it meant was that we could bring other people's states of play around a singular drawing, and that's a very powerful condition to take, because then you are able to say, hey, this stuff here, we've got lots of square paving, and this stuff here where you want mastic asphalt, why don't we do that one in mastic asphalt as well, and it'll cost you less, and it'll all work together, and it'll kind of start to join up. So the next slide shows you the same project where that negotiation, all of those dialogues, those discussions, each of these labels shows a detailed discussion about where we had to try to make agreements to do something or get some money. And so this interface between the public realm, the so-called public realm, and the private plots, all of the private players, is a massive negotiation. And it's really easier to design a very tall building down to design a public realm, because everyone feels that they own a piece of the public realm, which they do, because you tend to pay tax. You tend to kind of actually, it's kind of yours, you know, and it's highly contested, and it's very unclear who's kind of got priority, and it changes. So we became kind of fascinated with this constant battle between cars, cyclists, pedestrians, maintenance, access, and it's the kind of life of the city. And so we began to see that rather than just see it as a whole series of difficult situations, you could actually turn it into a way of working and enjoy it. So we sort of took this perspective that actually what you're looking at is a method of working, and you can make drawings about it, and drawings are the thing. And I wanted to talk a little bit today about drawings. The power of drawing is extreme. It's very exciting to draw. I actually once sat with a client who got all sweaty when I was drawing. It wasn't a very good drawing, but I was drawing something, and he started sweating, and he said, "I'm sorry, it's just like watching a Formula One racing driver driving dangerously fast, watching you drawing." And that was an extraordinary comparison to make, but I understood that what he was being very honest about it. He was really just like the language barrier between his ballpoint pen and his lined pad and taking the notes, and the idea of finding something that he could see was not evidenced or trailed or you couldn't see where that was going. That was just terrifying. It was fascinatingly terrifying, and I've never forgotten that moment, because it kind of exemplifies the freedom of drawing. That kind of thing that you do when you think, I wonder what I mean by this thought that I'm having, that someone said and I've responded to and I haven't concluded. And I think architecturally that's something that often gets covered up with illustrations. So architectural illustrations, of course, are often about showing a sketch scheme or a concept. But that's not the same as embarking into a language of provisional communication, whereby you ask someone else to engage or respond. So I think that's something to enjoy. Next one. So I'm going to spend 2 hours actually if I carry on talking this way, because it's quite long. But it's nice to talk about it. So these two streets were kind of two early projects, and this was this is the same one here. This is a second project, and this was the first one I've just been showing you. So here's the bridge, and now it's all the bridge through there. So we did that project, and since it was built, it's been dug up many times actually. It's really completely blasted. And you ask yourself, what's the value of it then? And actually, Hans van der Heyden made a very nice essay about the value, a series of interviews and writing about this notion of catch and steer, and this sort of idea of change and sustainability of ideas as well as design. And I think that architecture is not just the building, but it's the kind of series of platforms, it's a series of examples, an ongoing thing. And that's one of the reasons why I like this context, because as I'll say a bit more about in a minute, the ongoingness, the kind of consequentiality of the dialogue in this situation is very instructive for architecture. So the next slide really just shows you this project. This is in the late 90s, where it just felt like, as an architect, to have a site where the hoarding are the existing 19th century buildings is very exciting. And just seeing a traffic light being erected is all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, it's going to go there, and it does that thing, and suddenly it's spatial, and the railing, this guard railing here. We were so excited to put this guard railing in, which is so mundane, really, and to decide that it should be mundane, and you don't really need to look at it. So we were very excited about understanding all the things that you should not necessarily notice. And quite often before that, the streets were full of things that were asking to be noticed because of the branding of the 80s, whereby everything was sort of liveries, and you would have purple stripes, or you'd have lots of kind of bunting and big arched gateways, and it's kind of getting in the way of all of the place. So that was exciting. And then the next one too just shows you the kind of the stuff of the street, the kind of the simultaneity. Even while it's being built, you've got all of this stuff going on, and this was extremely exciting to understand. So this is when I met Paul for the first time, and he came into our office. Actually, he did I wasn't quite sure whether he was a graphic designer or an artist for a while. It took me about 20 years to realise he was an artist. And he came into our office and he did our letterhead. We'd asked him to design a letterhead, and he came in without saying anything, he just typed it into my computer, and that was it for 20 years. And we've recently changed it again, but that was very good. So he was interested in this font when we started saying that we wanted to name the public places. We wanted to put the public, in a way, that wanted to put the money that was coming forward for the project, which was part supported by tax, into the public realm to mark publicly accessible places like shops and supermarkets and libraries. And he likes this font, the so-called found font, which is the kind of, as he put it, the font that you use before you start working into it or embellishing it. And it's a very minimal font, and we were really pleased with that. So this kind of was a way of using the names of the streets very succinctly and quite poignantly by taking road and street and lane out quite often, and then you're just left with the figure, and many of these things are still here. And this big chunk of granite was an idea of exerting generosity in that moment between the curb, the pedestrian and the car, and just somehow trying to take on the determinants of a car turning circle, and the determinants of someone who can't see properly and therefore needs to use the tactile paving, and the determinants of a kind of black brick that would emulate the mastic asphalt on the other side. So everything's got its own driver, and that's very interesting spatially, when you have these different spatial consequences, what happens when they meet. So this marshalled the meeting of the different spatial consequences. Next slide is a terrazzo mat. It's a black and white photo actually, because the terrazzo is quite a nice colour. All of the names, in this case, shoe fair. And something that really bothered people was that the names, of course, changed pretty quickly after we put them in. And our idea there was that was really good. You know, that was kind of like, that's a normal thing that you have when you've got a stone that says so-and-so laid this 20 years ago. You don't expect it to be the same. And it's a bit like saying things change. Again, somehow quietly disturbing for many people, but in a way I think reassuring, because it always was that at some point. Next one. And we worked with so Demure on Kinas Fluyt when we got to this moment of the Tate. What's nice about this kind of moment is that, yes, the Tate Modern, but actually the thing that drove this was the notion from the head of Southwark Council that the wobbly bridge coming over from St Paul's would make it possible for people on the north side of the river to come to the south side of the river, almost unheard of, and buy a sandwich. And that was the regenerative aspect of the south part. And of course the Tate Modern is a mega destination, but really it was the access that kind of opened this up. So that's a really interesting kind of process. And then Paul's recently been back taking photos of Borough High Street. Actually this pavement is still here, much of it's been ripped out, there's a mat still there. But you can see there's this sort of general degradation, but actually the ideas are kind of still resonating. Next one. And so this idea of palettes of materials, how they meet, how you lay them out, has sort of carried on. And this drawing here was a later project in Farringdon, where we understood that they had several boroughs meeting, and we made a kind of patchwork of their streetscape palettes, and we made a big plan of how they might meet. And we didn't worry too much about the fact that they couldn't quite agree on the pallets. They would be different, but the thing you would do is join them carefully like a tailored coat. So it would be the spatial extents you place care into, rather than worrying about everything matching the whole time. So this sort of ability to kind of let things be different was also very interesting to us. Next one. This kind of approach started to suggest an idea that, two ideas really. One is that in this particular situation, the only place we could put buildings that didn't block the view of St Paul's was in the railway corridor where the river Fluyt used to run. And secondly, we could actually make very big public spaces by extending existing pieces of bridge. Next one. Another thing that we've looked at for many years is high streets, and we've talked a lot about what high streets are, and very interesting kind of around here as well. I've sort of noticed, I went on a really long walk just now actually, and I was walking past some very long buildings with really easily just accommodating a car wash and a kind of coffee shop and a bit of a druggy shop and then a nothing. And it's so good, you know, it's very difficult to get that, the kind of relaxedness that you get with the big building infrastructure. And this is in Brazil where everything's kind of charged up against each other, and the next one is, it's not such good quality, is it? This is Fluyt, which we did some work on, which was a similar kind of approach whereby we looked at the corners and we saw where things were happening and could you improve the crossings and start to make use of what you already have. Next one. Similarly, high streets in London as well. If you start to look at it very closely, you realise that they are not homogeneous, they're very heterogeneous, they're very different, they're very place-specific. And so we worked with that in this particular example through consultation, and the next slide shows a kind of an example of that, where you've got a 1950s parade, you work with the shop owners, put a bit of money into a nice piece of stone here, a stool riser, a nice sign. We worked with Alex Rich, artist, to call it a parade, because you call these stretches of buildings parades, which is quite nice. And you celebrate a kind of 1950s situation, and in this case we name all the people doing productive things in the street. Just to remind people that the high street is much more productive than they realise, you don't always see it. That was northeast London. So this is northwest London, and this is really just an example of how one can enjoy responding to a place when you're starting to plan for its change. So this is an area called Scrubs Lane in northwest London, and it's facing big regeneration change. It's facing huge amounts of buildings, and the question is, how do you do that? How do you organise it? And of course, if you look at this, you think nothing can change. This is one of the great, magnificent cemeteries. So the next slide shows you roughly where that is in London. So if that's Greenwich Park, that's where we are, Park Royal, Baldock, and that's the Lee Valley, where the New Olympic Park is. So it's a kind of new part of London changing. The next slide shows its beauty. There's a canal network where people used to come from the country and go out into the fields to sort of experience space outside the city. Next slide. And you get this kind of juxtaposition between this cemetery and this other side of Scrubs Lane, a very busy road, a very interesting industrial road, where all of the change is happening. So this is where all the change is happening, and that's the cemetery there. So this drawing is trying to kind of capture the situation. Next slide. And so this sketch was a way of trying to say big life, change, tube stations, spatially diverse frontages, routes, yards, and then quiet back contemporary ways. So by explaining what type of difference we're looking at in the next slide, and actually this sketch is one of those sketches where I didn't really know what I meant, but I was trying to kind of draw the cemetery and the tall buildings and the notion that they have to combine here. This is where that canal photograph was. And then that gives you this big change side, which is layered up, hopefully with uses. You've got the railway, and then you've got workshops on the ground floor, and then you've got some existing buildings, and you've got a quiet cemetery over there. So this is a way of trying to describe a section through a street that is very different from one side to the other. And talking to people who are there, finding out what they do, what they want, and sort of doing a mix and match, almost like a matchmaking conversation, so that when developers come forward to do a planning application, you can say, these people who make beer might want to go on the ground floor of your building, so you can kind of start to put it together. And then you start to be able to say, well, maybe the denser developments signify east-west connections, and by making these east-west connections which weren't there before, you start to knit the difference of the place together. Next. And then you come back to this canal spot where, with a new redevelopment, you can understand that the east-west connection, which actually in this image holds on to some of that condition that we saw in the photograph. It widens access and steps and stairs, and it tries to not displace everything with the new. It's very difficult not to kick out the old when you do the new, so it's about being precise, I think, and observant. This is another project. This one's West Croydon, so we're south of London now. And this is a kind of, this was a public realm project. So in case maybe I didn't say, but I'm talking about a lot of public realm projects in different ways, and then I'll get a little bit more to what we're doing here. So the situation here was that the station, West Croydon, which you're right, you can be tram, bus and train, so it's kind of well connected. But as a public realm, there's nothing there. I mean, it's really almost invisible. There's a church over there. This is the railway line, and then there's a few kind of chunks of buildings and old strips of ground. The next slide shows you that, in a way, what we did was we measured where the public space was, and we saw there's very little of it. It's all sort of bus stations and kind of office buildings. So the next slide shows you how the church sits around that, which was outside of the public realm. So this isn't public realm, it's kind of public scenography. It's obviously a public figure. And we tried to bring that into the bus station. So the next one shows you how we were kind of looking at the steeples. It did actually have a missing steeple. There was a kind of dialogue we had with local artists and people engaged to try to work out what it might do with the missing steeple. And we nearly rebuilt it actually in timber. We didn't quite manage that, but the next slide showed that we had an idea that if this is our public realm, this little strip of land here, and we have a wall and a car park and the church completely out of sight, then the next slide shows that we use specific, very detailed in this case, observations about the nature of the wall and the nature of the church. We try to bring them together by copying the rose window. So the next slide shows you how we get this rose window to kind of emulate the rose window. And you start to get a depth. You start to register the depth. And you not only enjoy the church, but you kind of enjoy the wall in a way as well. And then the public realm becomes a bit more public. The next slide is that other part where the railway was. Very narrow footway, so we made it wider. We made a new fence. And the fence emulates the arched shop fronts. In the next slide you can see how we did that, and this was a very difficult thing to achieve because we have to cantilever the ground back over the land next to the railway, which is, it's like, we're going to stop all the trains, it's going to be millions of pounds. In the end it was just negotiation, discussion, putting heads together, and all it is really is a fence. But what's nice about it is it's genuinely wider. The plants grow up it. There's this sort of figure which recalls the historic shops nearby. And you get these kind of nice peculiar eccentricities, which Croydon is really good at. So it's kind of a huge pot with a huge little tree in it and some other seating down the way. We had this sort of discussion about Croydonness. You could talk about Rotterdamness as well. Like I was walking around near the Kunsthal earlier, and I was trying to work out the things I was standing on, the ground, was that Rotterdam or was that using materials to be Rotterdam? Like, was it Rotterdam, that thing I was standing on, or was it portraying its Rotterdamness with some concrete paving? It's a kind of slightly stupid question, really, but I suddenly was a bit transfixed by it. It's like, are things the thing, or are they representing the thing? Minor diversion. So, just to say that we're doing buildings, and I mentioned earlier, we're always trying to kind of situate them, as well as make them have some sense. So this building here is a hotel in Stratford, and the diagram here is really just saying something very simple, that this building has a shape and it says one thing to the park. They are intimate and together, and they know about each other, but so does this. This is a very ugly building, and we really enjoyed this, making friends with it. Same height, slightly gentle, like this tries to make a chamfer. And then this end here gives on to the green space here. This height here relates to this 1960s height. And then at the back, you have this softer relationship with these 1940s informal spaces. So the building kind of tries to work all around. And that's interesting because you see so many buildings which are set on their site, and they, like this bowl we talked about a bit earlier, which is kind of dominating space, but it's not actually shaping the space, it's sort of taking advantage of the space by being in such an overt shape. And this idea that Smithson's talked about, the charged void, this sort of setting of something in a particular relationship with another thing, making that deliberate, is a very interesting and special thing to do, I think, with buildings as well as with the public space. And so the next slide shows you, an example of this from the park. So you see this facade. The windows here are quite regular. They get bigger at the top, so in perspective you kind of they compensate for the perspective view. And actually you can't see it so well from here, but the mortar joint is the same colour as the brickwork on the front, but on the side it's a different colour, so it looks like two bricks. So this thing here looks flat and a bit like a sort of a New York proud front, a bit like a napped flint. When you crack a flint in half, you get that flatness. And then at the side, the sills poke out a little bit more, things get a bit looser, and the shape kind of gives over to different forms. So the next slide shows you the back. And these windows here, they don't line up completely. They're very slightly moving, just to soften up slightly. And then this here gives you like a little house sitting on this big building, which enjoys the sort of scale specificity at high levels. So you have the big view of the huge landscape, and you do that from within a little table space, which is human scale. And then here, this is that space I mentioned, giving onto the green. So here, these two are envisaged to open up and allow people to use this underused green space. This is one of those green spaces you get in many places where you have tall buildings, modern buildings, sat into a green space, and you don't really use it because no one's really sure if it's theirs or not. So we try to kind of join in with the green space there and try to kind of get the two buildings to work together. And that was actually particularly difficult. The client didn't really want to do it because he had to pay for smoke guards there. The council didn't really want to do it because they didn't really know if it was really their land because of the people living here. We couldn't really speak to the people there because they were such a transient kind of group of people living there. So what we did is we just decided to make it possible to open up the doors, and then we try and kind of let time sort of work its way. So making it possible is also an option. Okay, so this was a more recent time when I met Paul, and he invited me on this ICA talk, which was very funny because he introduced me as a curb scholar, whatever the hell that is. It's like an expert in curbs, which was supposedly what I was doing. So we had these people joining us in a walk. It was one of the most interesting walks I've ever been on, actually, because nothing really held anything together apart from the walk. And we walked around, and yeah, I talked about invisible signs and curbs, and someone else talked about the history of buildings in Fluyt, and someone else sung opera in Burlington Arcade to Paul's silence. So she sung the sound of a police siren in the arcade, and that was spectacular. So Paul's got this kind of uncanny ability, I think, to celebrate something that was almost not worth even looking at. And he picks up on the marginal, I think, and he doesn't sort of fetishize it. I think he's just kind of finding it, seeing all the stuff that is all around and a little bit unnoticeable, and until you pick it up and look at it, it seems like nothing, and then you realise it's actually the thing you're really looking for. And he would articulate that much better than I would on his behalf. But I enjoy working with him because we always have conversations that often lead to things not changing very much, which is curious when you're trying to be propositional. Next slide leads us here, where Mazio invited me with him to get involved in this. So now there's this kind of conversation about this gallery, this opportunity to get involved with a whole range of interesting people to do something in this gallery space. And I came here and we had a walk, and it seemed very nice to pick up on the Rotterdamness. And to me, the Rotterdamness has a kind of, I mean, this doesn't capture Rotterdam, because I really love Rotterdam, but it's an aspect of Rotterdam, which is this material, this kind of textured cast concrete. And of course, this moment here, as you saw in the text that was in the newsletter, if you look at it very hard, without being too romantic about it, it does actually capture a lot of things that's going on. You've got the drain, which tells you about the underground servicing in the city. You've got the moss that shows you it's been there for a while. You see that these pieces have been laid carefully but slightly relaxed in order to bump a car away from someone standing there. Two roads are meeting. These blocks here are laid in such a way that allows water to flow through, takes the water away. The candle on the carriageway throws the water here. That's why the leaves are all kind of round the edge. And so there's a kind of sense to all of this, but it's not a public realm. And so, and then the question is, well, what do you mean public realm? There's something very interesting about the way the streets are laid out in Rotterdam, where everything's hyper-functional. You've got kind of cycle lane, footway, median, tram, bush, hedge, cycle lane, footway, and everything's kind of striated. And crossing it, I'm looking left and right like a crossy road sort of chicken, you know. And then when there's so that's not public realm, that's like functionality lined up. And then when you go to a public space or a park, it's almost like it's never heard of this stuff over here. So the relationship is just not, and maybe there shouldn't be, you know, why should there be a relationship? But it's more extreme, sort of disassociation of public spaces. And I'm not actually saying that's a problem or bad, I'm just sort of wanting to notice it, because it's really interesting. So the next slide, I think, was a sketch. One of our students did a sketch some years ago. And somehow this extension of the ground into the building seemed, you know, even the corner of the building is a curve in this sense. So the curve is here and the curve is here. It kind of makes total sense. It's kind of windows and it's materials, and you know, it's like invitation to be next to the thing that is giving you city presence and views through and ways across. So it's like, you know, maybe we could have some more in here. If there's an idea, and I still haven't quite worked it out, is the idea of this year-long exhibition about, I think it's about openness, and I think it's about finding out what we already knew. And I like the idea that we're working with things which, flutes, you know, everyone knows what a flute is or what the sound of a flute is, but until you see it or hear it, you didn't realise that you didn't fully know it. The same with the pavement outside, you know, notice if you bring it in, we're going to be walking on the pavement and then the carriageway and then some asphalt and then we're going to have a kitchen with some tactile paving on the back. And so there'll be this kind of gentle, and then there'll be a planter over there as well with the same pieces that has the plants. So I've got a few slides actually, just the next slide I think shows a few more. Oh yeah, and so I had this thought, this feeling of it coming in, that could be nice. And the gallery then becomes a sort of generous mirror, like a generous amplifier for something that's the state of play. And then Paul was sort of giving me these completely un-Rotterdam sort of ideas about showers in California, I think. I sort of thought that doesn't really fit with the idea, but then it completely fits really if you sort of do it in the same way that it's a planter and then you're the plant getting wet with a column of the same bricks. So it doesn't, you can tweak it to fit. So the next slide shows you the ubiquity really of things that comfort and hold capacity for public access in the way that this gallery will. All it's doing is giving you an infrastructure for stuff to happen within it. So it's relatively open, but it's going to have a material presence which can be enjoyed. And that planter, that's the inspiration for that planter. We'll have to see what it looks like. We'll have to see if it's too heavy as well, if it cracks through the floor or something.
What's interesting about the plants in this planter is also that they have this stingy, like they put this sharp needles to kind of probably prevent people from.
That's right, and that's very interesting, because what that does, that creates a void in the city. It's like it's a keep away rather than smell the roses and get near it. Next one. Yeah, so it's really just some slides really about. I mean, we once did a project with the students where we got them to take photos of the city, and wherever they saw a sign, asked them to cut them out of the photograph, and then put an orange background to it. And of course then suddenly you think there's orange everywhere, it's like signs everywhere, and it's a really strong blue, and the next one is a strong red. And they are very clear, they're great actually, but they are so familiar and so kind of functional that to take those out of context also helps to unlock a whole load of other perceptions in various ways. The next slide is bird boxes that Paul will be looking at, I think, somehow, on the back.
Yeah, well,
a bit
almost stole one. But,
almost stole one?
Yeah, but I decided to leave it there. So maybe you can say something about the looking from here.
Yeah, maybe that's the next, or soon.
The next one?
Yeah. Rather nice lumps. We're going to try and get one or two in here as well if we can, to join in with the planter, so it turns into a sort of communal social moment, because they don't have these in groups, do they? They've only got individual ones, so you can only sit alone in a social way. As soon as you go two, it's antisocial, isn't it? I'm going to have so many discussions about antisocial seating, and it's just unbelievable. It's like it's the criminal activity to sit down. Next one. Sitting down, this is quite a nice piece of rubber that is in the playground at the back, and actually it feels to me like that would be a nice surface to put on the extension at the back of the building. I'll show you in a minute. Next. This sort of junky view, something that Paul kept on. I realised that when he's joking, he's not really joking, so he was sort of talking about this being the exhibition in a way, this sort of junk, and I think, I know what he means. It's like, how more immediate do you want to get? Like, how much less do you want me to tell you what I'm saying to you? You know, it's like, what more do you need me to tell you about how little there is to say? So it's quite a beautiful observation that he thought that this could be the start of the exhibition, which has apparently already started. Is it the launch today? Is this launching? Mm-hmm. No, it is. Well, it's a sort of soft entry. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Next one. So, yeah, it's quite nice to see the space and the space. Looks different. Looks smaller. In real life, it looks really big. Yeah. And this is sort of, yeah, I mean, actually, I think that glass, that reflective aspect, is going to be good because the planter will double. Maybe we can even do actually only half a planter completed in reflection. That could save weight.
What's interesting about this was this blind was a part of a previous exhibition.
Oh yeah.
That also covered the front window. We took that away, we left this there. But our relationship with the neighbors, the barber, wasn't that good. I mean, from the beginning they were like, who are these people suspicious looking? They didn't want to collaborate with us. And then now they say, take this away, we cannot see you.
Really?
Yeah, but we are not going to.
So keep it a bit longer. It's got a very nice Dan grain quality about it, sort of complexity, especially at the corner, and the sort of playful reflection and amplification is appropriate in this context, I think. Next, just the shape of the building is intriguing, and it's some very strange layerings to the walls, and you get the sense of the kind of it's almost like the walls are addressing to a larger shell, and I think that's going to be nice as a setting for the addition of the floor. Domestic looking in a way, almost like there's a chimney going up. Next. And today we were looking at this mat, how to get, kind of thought it would be good to have the hopscotch mat in the entrance. You've got this rather didactic play instruction in Rotterdam where you're told as children to play on the hopscotch areas. And it seems nice to sort of bring that in and say you've still got to play, you're still playing. It hasn't changed just because you've gone into the art gallery. Next one. And then up here, out on the roof, well, this is completely extraordinary. I mean, I actually couldn't believe it when I came here, and I went up the staircase and realised I couldn't stand up. And then Maziar was saying, and it would be very nice if we could get out onto the roof, which involves stepping over a kind of like, this would be the window height, so you sort of step over that. I mean, in London, we'd just be closed down, it's just like, this is not accessible, you can't do it. And I really love the fact that this was all semi-relaxed, and you've already met a few official people who have said, yeah, if you kind of sort yourself out in this way and that. So I kind of love that this is going to be quite a peculiar scale. You will go up to something where you can barely stand up. There will be an artist in residence up there. There will be a process by which you step through this window onto this roof, and then you get this other world. So at the street out here, you've got this striated, quite sort of slightly stern but relatively accommodating, especially with the lovely buildings, the kind of sort of street. And then here you've got this park, A and B, and the gallery joins the two together. So the next slide is this is the idea. Actually, I'm going to sort of show you in a minute in a sketch. But basically, what's really nice about this is you get this blue limestone stool riser. And again, the building is not trying very hard to show off. I don't think anyone ever designed this building to show off, but there are so many buildings in the area that just have this adept presentation on the street. It's almost like wearing good clothes to sort of feel good, not to show off, but just to feel good in the situation. So the suitability of that limestone stool riser that extends itself into the step, where all the kicking and the dust and the dirt and the kind of tough stuff is sort of happily accommodated, gives onto the timber window, the generous glass. It's very beautiful, and I think we really struggle to do it in London with new buildings these days. I think people can't do this straightforwardness very easily. They're overthinking it, and it's very difficult to be plain and still have that powerful presence. So it's kind of inspiring. But there's the street, strong building, and I don't know if I've got the next slide. Yeah, it's all in a random order actually. So here's the hopscotch, I mentioned that. Next one. Oh yeah, and this is the planter surround. So this is this kind of rather beautiful. Is it beautiful? It's sort of, it's round. It's at least round, let's say that. It's kind of not that, maybe beautiful is the wrong word, but if you look at this and that, there's a matter-of-factness about it. There's a kind of plainness, but functionality, purposefulness. It's something you can work with. It's distinctive. It's also generic. And something very interesting about this genericness, and yet the fact it's got a place specificity to it. How does that work? Quite tricky to pull that off. So use it and test it and see whether it is, extend. So here's the back. You've got the bear, and this is like a Robert Rauschenberg painting. Actually, this is beautifully collaged already. You don't have to do much more. But you will, because you will occupy it with the next slide. So, yeah, this was me trying to. This was actually me after Mazzy was saying, Julian, you've got to give us a drawing. We need to know what we're going to do. And this is all I could come up with at the time because I was struggling, and I think it was late actually in the day, and I was wondering what to do, and I had a chat with Dan in the office, and we sort of talked a little bit about the street and the park, and I just realised that actually what's going on is that they are both there. So this is coming in, and this is being accessed by that upper part there. So the two of them are just having a nice conversation in different ways. And so actually that balcony and the park are quite opposite companions in the sense that the park has enclosures and compounds and fences and plots. That's the spatial distribution of the park, and so this is striated and that's plotted. And so this is a plot and this is striated. And you start to get this sort of urban proximity of unalikes, which is always nice. It's kind of always nice when you get unalikes who are happily next to each other, deliberately so. And the gallery, of course, articulates that very adeptly because there will be so many different things to experience within it. And it will change, and it won't be finished, and it's already started. So that contingency, that kind of ongoing dialogue. And actually there's something maybe I should say that I particularly enjoy, the fact that this is not like an architectural project. And it's not that I get to be more creative, but it's that I get to free fall a little bit more in the conversation. So I'll say something, you'll respond. Paul will say something different to you, I'll respond to him. Someone else says something. It's completely open. Someone would say chaotic, but it's not chaotic, it's completely open. And that space is incredibly generous, and that's valuable, and that's something that doesn't just have to happen in art galleries, I think. I think it can happen anywhere, any time of the week, ideally, for happiness, if you're making things in any sense. No, I think you're right, and there's been very little rhetoric about art in this situation, which is good.
Yeah.
It's like, let's describe it first, and then we see what kind of artistic value it has later if one wants to look. But actually the dialogue has been about other things, as you say, on a kind of it's an analytical level, but it's within the context of opinions and positioning, which is interesting because the position is not fixed, it's shifting. One thing shifts it around, and there's a give and a take. And so it's not just evidence leading to analysis, it's ideas. And ideas, I think, are one of the most important things that we should have in cities, because if you just build through sheer conveyor belt process, and that does happen, then you get a city of little consequence or little positioning, and then you have to kind of reappraise it more purposefully. So, and that's like you, as a community, have not taken responsibility for your own city. It's kind of crazy. So, positioning yourself, even as an observer, especially as an observer, seems to be more essential, I think. That's a drawing of the. So that was the kind of an early version of the scheme. So here's the square paving, that's the herringbone paving. They don't make it anymore, apparently, but they make something like it. So the square paving comes through the hopscotch, the planter. You step up onto this, and then step down again into the herringbone, which will lead over to that wall. And then there's asphalt, and there's a kitchen, and then there's the tactile paving backsplash, and then there's the shower. Then you go upstairs, and something will happen which we haven't quite got to yet, and then you stand outside on the balcony, which I think is in the next. Maybe it's not quite the next slide. Yeah, okay, slightly more clear version of what we're talking about. So this is a fairly, sort of boring drawing that shows a really. I like the fact that it's boring because it's sort of. I know how lovely it's going to be when it's done in here. It's going to be really almost missable, but the extent of the materials is going to be really enjoyable. I'm looking forward to the kind of sectional variety as you walk up and down these things. And then getting to the end, it's going to be very nice because there's going to be these pipes running around on the floor which start to open up this thing of tubes and pipes. And I don't think we put holes in them because it's got hot water coming to the shower, so it's bursting up. Next. So this was the first idea about what to do on the balcony. This is the kind of Alice in Wonderland window which you crawl through. Kind of like the idea that because there's 3 windows, one's blanked off. If you go through this one, you go into a space, but not on that bit. And then I thought maybe it's nicer the other way around, where you see through this, that's outside. See through this, looks the same, but then you're inside. And then this is like a ball court, which emulates the ball court you see beyond. With the black rubber I showed you earlier, and it just has that sense of if there's a playable space up on the roof of the building floating above the other ball court and the park, you're kind of in that plotted green landscape, perhaps with a chicken coop. And the last 2 slides, Maziar heroically went looking for Rotterdam and found it. This is where they make it. This is where they make Rotterdam space. And so, that's beautiful. It's like, that's amazing, isn't it? It's like, is that Rotterdam underneath it? Or is that Rotterdam? Or is it just all Rotterdam? Kind of all is really, isn't it? It's just that it keeps moving. And so we can choose where to put it. And so we can choose to put it, instead of here, we can bring it in here. And the last slide is this kind of lovely. In a way, what this does, it says something about the decisions by which people locate things. So, very sensibly, they stack this to take up less space. But of course, it becomes quite sculpturally purposeful. This too, this looks kind of Egyptian with these loaves of bread that stop cars parking up on the curb. And so they've got this kind of simple presence. And they kind of stimulate the mind. They make you think, am I being childish to think that there's some other use for this thing or other role? But I think it's just great. It's very exciting to find different ways to see the city around you and find new ways to work with it. And that is the last slide. Thanks.